Support for this episode of Trifles comes from the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 264, The Archetypical Holmes. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you feeling your typical self today?
I'm feeling very imposterish, actually. I think I could be impersonating myself.
Oh, good Lord. Well, you look like you're impersonating someone. Folks here aren't seeing the video that I'm seeing, but you've got your deerstalker on. So I have a feeling what direction this is going. How appropriate.
Yes, well, Walter Paget. I always do my Walter Paget impression around January.
Well, that's just fine, you know, because Walter, of course, was the model for the Sherlock Holmes of Sidney Paget. You know, when you have a brother close at hand who can be a model, why not reach for him if you're an artist?
We're just lucky that aren't we lucky that Sidney Paget's brother didn't look like Danny DeVito?
Or that he didn't look like William Gillette, because then what would Frederick Dorr Steele have done?
Here, yes.
Indeed. Well, if you are looking for the show notes for this episode, you can find them at ihose.co/trifles264. That's all lowercase. If you type those out, that'll take you directly to the show notes. They're also, of course, in a link within whatever podcast app you happen to be using, or on our website, which is SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can simply leave a comment on that particular page, or you can email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And of course, catch up with us on all of our social networks where we are at I Hear of Sherlock. Now, this is interesting because this is the first in a series of a monthly ongoing series that we are calling, oh gosh, what are we calling this? The Master's Class. The Master's Class. You know, we have resurrected the Sherlock Holmes, the Theorist, where we look at old pieces of scholarship, things that you might not easily be able to get your hands on. And what we thought we would do with the Master's Class, and this is courtesy of the brain of my delightful co-host, is that we would take you through some award-winning articles, some articles that really represent the best of Sherlock Holmes scholarship, that perhaps look at certain trifling issues in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Now, one source that we're delving into is a book called A Remarkable Mixture, award-winning articles from the Baker Street Journal. This is edited by Stephen Rothman, who, of course, is the editor of the BSJ. It's a book that was put together in 2007 by the Baker Street Irregulars Press. By the Wessex. No, it was by the Baker Street Irregulars. The cover was done by Wessex Press. But, of course, this was done by the Baker Street Irregulars because they are the ones who own the copyright to all of the BSJ material. And the Morley Montgomery Award was something that was invented in 1958 by Lou David Feldman. He announced the establishment of the Morley Montgomery Memorial Award in the sum of $100 to be given annually to the individual contributing the outstanding article, in judgment of the editor, to the Baker Street Journal. And of course, it's named after Christopher Morley and James Montgomery, who had died just a few years earlier. And it ran for quite a few years before kind of taking a holiday. I think it went from 1958 through, 1979, and then was resurrected in 1995. And this tradition still continues today. I believe the nominal amount now is maybe $221, and a subscription to the BSJ, but it is by acclamation of a committee who decides what the best article is. And the most recent Morley Montgomery Award was announced at the BSI weekend on January 14th, 2022, and it is none other than our friend Russell Merritt, who has joined us on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere a couple of times, for his article, The Madman's Sherlock Holmes, the Doubleday Omnibus Edition. It was in the spring 2021 Baker Street Journal, and he looks through all of the old editions of the complete Sherlock Holmes, both in America and in the UK. The author's edition, the Crowborough edition, the Doubleday edition, Garden City Press, etc. So it's worth going back and checking out if you haven't.
Mm-hmm.
So for this inaugural episode in the master's class, what are we looking at as far as a masterful article, Bert?
We are going back to 1968 and an essay written by Paul Anderson, that appeared in volume 18, number 3, the September 1968 Baker Street Journal, called The Archetypical Holmes.
Now that alone is interesting because usually it's archetypal, not archetypical, right? Or archetypal. Right. I don't know how you prefer to pronounce it, but it's not typical, it's tipple.
Right. Archetypical. No, that's how he phrased it. And I hope our listeners know Paul Anderson. If you don't, I envy you because there's an enormous amount of literature that you can connect to. He was a leading science fiction writer. He passed away in 2001. Among his career, he won the Hugo Awards 7 times, just a whole history of awards. He was a real innovator and a literary giant. And it's interesting because this, of course, is one of these crossover areas where interest in science fiction, adventure fiction, and so on crosses over into the world of Sherlock Holmes. And he was also a dedicated Sherlockian who had won the Morley Montgomery Award previously.
Yeah, I think he is the only 2-time winner of the Morley Montgomery Award, and deservedly so. And interestingly enough, I have Paul Anderson's copy of the Heritage Press Complete Sherlock Holmes, inscribed by Edgar Smith.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's grand. Did he make any notes in it, I wonder? Paul Anderson?
Oh, that's a good question.
I have to go look.
I ought to go back and check.
Yeah. Well, in the Archetypical Holmes, Paul Anderson really demonstrates just a variety of things. His wide-ranging reading, his humor, his writing ability. He begins the article by talking a little bit about Jung and the definition of an archetype. But we can skip over the joy of learning about Carl Gustav Jung. Webster defines archetype as the original pattern, and this is the point here about Sherlock Holmes, the original pattern of which all things of the same species are representations or copies, the original idea, the model or type. And, says Paul Anderson, that really sums up Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is an archetype. And Paul Anderson says in this essay, the general idea of a Holmesian figure had been slowly evolving for a long time, but its time was ripe in the late 19th century, and the elements crystallized in Sherlock Holmes. Holmes gave them their essential eternal shape. And Anderson observes it doesn't matter that he actually existed. He could just as well have been only a character in a story. But he expressed certain vital factors in his culture. And as a result, the Holmes figure has reappeared in any number of reincarnations already and seems likely to go on indefinitely. And I love this observation from 1968 because, of course, he had no way of knowing what the decades would then bring. And this is an area that we've talked about recently, too, with our friend Bob Katz, who talked about the constant resurgence of Sherlock Holmes in the B movies and in the cinema and in all kinds of media.
Yeah. And, again, you've got this imprint of a type of personality with, certain quirks along the way, certain things that were cemented in the Victorian times. But again, there are others that are timeless about him. And whether you place him in the 19th century, the 20th century, the 22nd century or beyond, there are all kinds of opportunities for Sherlock Holmes to make and remake his appearance.
The most Holmesian figure, Anderson says, I can think of, real or imaginary, in the ancient world that reminds him of Sherlock Holmes is Archimedes. He lived in the 3rd century BC and is best known popularly for his detective work when he proved that alloy had been substituted for gold in a royal crown. And the legend is that when the solution came to him, he leapt from his bath and ran down the streets crying, "Eureka! I have found it!" And how reminiscent that is, isn't it, from the first appearance we have of Sherlock Holmes when Watson comes upon him in the Path Lab at St. Bart's.
I love that. Eureka, that is probably the identifying word of Archimedes. And by the way, Archimedes, he was a principled fellow. Of course, he discovered the principle of buoyancy and of mass displacing or volume displacing mass in the bathtub. And that was his eureka moment, literally his eureka moment.
Yeah. I wonder what happened to the duck. It's these little details that are never covered in history. I'll have to go back and look. But Paul Anderson points out, this seems to be, one of the characteristics that belongs peculiarly to Western civilization, this seminal figure of Archimedes, who was said to have been aesthetic and very brusque. And of course, Sherlock Holmes has some of these attitudinal capabilities. Is Merlin, the magician, confidant of King Arthur, says Anderson, not Holmesian in several ways? Well, we think of him as gaunt and enigmatic and possessed of knowledge and intelligence such as granted to no one else. And incidentally, for him, too, there was just one woman of dubious associations and dangerous ambitions. And still more Holmesian is the northern god Odin, or Wotan, if you prefer the operatic name, described as wise and shrewd and benevolent and terrible, who fights the powers of evil with cunning rather than a spear. Tall and lean and dignified. Inventor of magical techniques, the linguist who first read the runes, the brooding foreknower of the inevitable future. Well, Anderson points out that as European history proceeds, we find men appearing oftener and oftener in fact and fiction. Now, of course, it's mostly men who look increasingly Holmesian. He says, think about Roger Bacon in the Middle Ages and Francis Bacon in the Elizabethan era. And then people like Machiavelli, a much maligned thinker who was simply a frank realist. And Leonardo da Vinci, who Anderson says I once suggested might be a collateral ancestor of Sherlock Holmes. The type becomes rare again during the upheavals of the Reformation, but in the Enlightenment it flourishes more luxuriant than ever before. Newton, Leibniz are obviously proto-Holmeses, as well as Locke and Hume and Voltaire.
Oh, that's a marvelous assortment. And you could make the argument that during the Reformation, the Holmesian archetype had to go underground. It was a dangerous time for abstract thinkers and independents to be voicing themselves. It was really all about adhering to the precepts of the church in particular. So we could understand why there was that moment of silence.
Yeah, absolutely. And he says, a long, stable peace brought forth this sort of man afresh and plentifully. And he names, some more names, including John Stuart Mill and, of course, Dr. Joseph Bell. And then we are in the age of Victoria. And the hour had really arrived because the master came into being.
Well, we will advance from the past to the present to the future right after this quick word. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. Well, we were treated to a wonderful bit of a Wellesian time machine journey there, from Archimedes up to the Victorian era, at least. And this is where Anderson's imagination, I think, really begins to flourish. I mean, yes, we can all look back to those figures that are universal to so many of us in Western culture, and say, yes, these are the archetypes that inspired Holmes, inspired Doyle, etc., or who were the progenitors of Holmes. But this is where Paul Anderson and his knowledge of the present and of the future, because he was a science fiction writer after all, really begins to flourish. So what do we find?
It really does. He remarks that the Holmes archetype feels most at home in a free but essentially orderly society. And he points out an enclave, to your point, an enclave of this remains to a degree in sciences. So it's not surprising that many scientists and engineers have a great deal in common with Sherlock Holmes. Their work depends on both intellect and physique. They are devoted, clean living, but comparatively aloof and eccentric men. To name just one, says Anderson, I might observe that the oceanographer and deep-sea explorer Jacques-Yves Cousteau goes so far as to look like Sherlock Holmes. But on the whole, though, there are few Victorian adventurers left, and it's more obvious in literature than in life. The protagonist of the mystery and suspense story today, he says, is apt to be a drab organization man. I don't say this is good or bad, but I just wish reality was a little different. But, he says, we can turn to sheer fantasy for escape, and that branch of fantasy known as science fiction. And here we find the Holmes archetype enjoying a very good health, thank you. It dominates the field so thoroughly that other kinds of hero are in danger of becoming extinct. Take, for instance, he says, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Are not Strider and especially Gandalf Holmesian personalities? For that matter, is Sauron not another Moriarty? And are the Hobbits not a multiple John H. Watson? Now he's writing here in 1968. The popularity of this epic, particularly among younger readers, is encouraging. It suggests that man has not altogether abandoned the wish for a sane and decent order of things.
There you have it, right? That, of course, was why Sherlock Holmes became so popular at the height of the Victorian age. It was about creating order out of chaos. And chaos theory, of course, reigns supreme in science and science fiction circles. And Paul Anderson knows this very well. So anytime you have a character that can create some order, that can bring certainty to an uncertain world, this is where the Holmesian archetype really begins to flourish.
Science fiction, in the strict sense, is positively loaded with Holmes types. But mainly, he says, I'd like to point out that one science fiction personality who has seized the mass imagination as no other has ever done is pure Holmes. I refer, he says, to Mr. Spock on the television show Star Trek. Mr. Spock, he says, is only second in command of the spaceship Enterprise, but it's plain that Captain Kirk depends upon him every bit as much as a certain gracious lady depended on the master. Spock exalts the intellect and derides the emotions in the strictest tradition. But also in that tradition, he obviously has intense feelings that he never ordinarily reveals. He's courteous, but distant where women are concerned, except on one or two occasions when he can no longer help himself. He has the cat-like neatness and curiosity of a Holmes. He exasperates his less intellectual companions, but usually meets their sarcasms with a ready and biting wit. At the same time, he's athletic, cool, capable in danger. He's withdrawn, austere, philosophical, and is played by Leonard Nimoy, allowing for the uniform and the pointed ears, presents an excellent physical image of Sherlock Holmes. One thing he lacks on the show, of course, is a Watson, but in real life, he says, he has thousands as devout as any Baker Street irregular. Some publish magazines about him. When Star Trek, Anderson writes, finally goes off the air, which I hope will not be for a long while, Leonard Nimoy will be looking for a new role. I suggest that he's the perfect successor to Basil Rathbone, and that you write to the networks and movie companies saying so. I further suggest his popularity is another hopeful sign. His fans and their children may well create a new age of Victoria.
That is extremely well done, and prescient as well. Leonard Nimoy did go on to play Holmes on the stage, and in one short film, I think it was an industrial film. We'll have links to those write-ups as we remembered Leonard Nimoy when he passed away. We have those over on the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere website, so make sure you click through to see those. And it strikes me as interesting because Spock, he's known as being a Vulcan from the planet Vulcan, but he was half human, right? His father was a Vulcan, his mother was fully human, so he is half human. And it seems to me that I recall some tale when Watson called Holmes half human. He certainly called him an automaton at one time.
Yeah, right.
Which, of course, brings us to Star Trek The Next Generation, when we've got Data as an android, an actual automaton playing Sherlock Holmes, with Geordi as his Watson. So this Trekkian kind of tradition of establishing the connection between Sherlock Holmes and its characters continues to go on. And, of course, our pal Nick Meyer, who directed Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, in that later movie, had Spock uttering the words, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It's something one of my ancestors once said.
Yes.
So again, the nod to Sherlock Holmes in Star Trek.
Well, it's a wonderful set of connections, and it's amazing, as you point out, how prescient Paul Anderson was. And the lovely thing is that when you think about Sherlockian scholarship and put this in context, it's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
An ancestor of mine maintained that if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.